Good morning. It's great to be here on this Lord's Day, and it's always great this time of year. It seems like our auditorium, our sanctuary is just a little more full with people coming into town, visiting family, college students home, and that's just a joy and something that we get to celebrate. And also, I think this is a time of year where maybe generally speaking, people are full of good works, but I think especially here at Lost River, this is a time of year when this church family and so many individuals and families are devoted to good works. And there's so many things going on right now, whether that was an organized event, kind of separate and apart from Lost River itself, but whether that was Giving Tuesday or the taking care of the widows that's going on. I think even as we speak, there's like packages being made. All of that is just wonderful, and it's amazing and encouraging to see. And not just those like outward specific works, but I'm so encouraged by people's faith. Maybe even faith through some really hard and trying circumstances. I'm amazed by the faith that I see in this group when I look out. But this morning we're in a series, part 3 of a 4-part series about winter. Now, winter, as you well know, can be a pretty harsh time. Now, right now, it's not so bad. Right? It's supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. Everybody is merry and bright, unless your heart is 2 sizes too small, like the Grinch. But winter can be pretty brutal. It can be brutal, it can be harsh, it can be frustrating. It can be difficult to get through the traffic and the frustrations that come, and it can be, let's just say, complicated. Winter can be complicated. And so that's why for this month, we've been focusing on this simple series, How to Get Through Winter. How to Get Through Winter. When I think about winter, on one hand, it is that merry and bright time, but it presents challenges, and not just challenges like the obstacles I put before you on the screen, but obstacles that some people are dealing with in terms of family. Maybe there's a family who's lost a loved one, and this is the first kind of holiday season without them. That's a hard and challenging time. Or maybe while everybody's merry and bright, you are going through some difficult crisis, sickness or financial struggles or marriage struggles, whatever it might be. And what winter means for us is what this series is all about. It's not just the literal physical winter that we're trying to trudge through as a church family, but the winters of life. These seasons of trial and difficulty. How do we get through winter? Well, the past 2 lessons have been, number 1, embrace it together. We never embrace winter alone, but we go into it together. And we, as the church, strive to be like that Proverbs 31 woman when it describes her as not being afraid of the snow. That's who we as the church are meant to be, not afraid of the snow, that we're a place where people can come and feel the warmth of God as we strive to be what we talked about last week, that light of the world. And so this week we're going to talk about how to get through winter by keeping the fire burning. We want to be the light of the world, but it's hard to be the light when you feel like that flame is burning out. And we all know what that's like. One moment we're on fire, this kind of mountaintop experience, everything is great and well and good. And then in the next moment, maybe something happens to us, maybe there's some crisis, or it could just be random. We don't know exactly why, but all of a sudden that zeal starts to fade. And we feel cold, and this sort of spiritual apathy settles in. And while there will always be highs and lows, I think the danger is in normalizing this spiritual apathy. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones says this. He says, opposition to zeal can be one of the greatest hindrances to revival. So if we as a church want to be that city that's set on a hill, glowing with light, ablaze with the fire of God, one of the greatest obstacles to that is those who are settled into this spiritual apathy in opposition to zeal. And he says, and it is the particular danger of people in a state of lifeless tradition. In other words, what he's saying is people like us. Now, I'm not saying that our tradition is lifeless, but what Lloyd-Jones has in mind is people who were born and raised on the church pews, as it were. People who have come and assembled week after week and dedicated their lives to Christ. There's a tendency for that to become a kind of lifeless tradition, for this to become routine and mundane. And he's warning against that. And so when we settle into this spiritual apathy, it's almost like refusing to cut wood for the winter. Now, we don't really have to do that today, but it's like refusing to prepare for winter. Settling into the spiritual apathy is just like that. And you might survive winter, but you're never going to thrive. You might flicker. You might be this smoldering wick, but you're never going to be ablaze. You're never going to be that light. But this is what we want. This is what we desire. And so in contrast to that, listen to what Paul says in Romans 12 and verse 11. He says, do not be slothful in zeal. I love that expression. Don't be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Spiritual apathy and burnout was never meant to be normal. Normal is this zeal and fervor for the Lord. And that means, I think, two things, or maybe I should say it doesn't mean two things. Number one, this is not talking about pure emotionalism. This is not just sensationalism. It's not just this inner feeling, this inner experience where we just kind of keep to ourselves and it just creates this euphoric sense inside of us. That's not the zeal that's being described here. Instead, it's about this burning devotion to know and love God. It reminds me of what's known as the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, the familiar passage that Jesus will later quote in the New Testament. But it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God." Listen to the devotion, listen to the zeal in this, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. This is biblical zeal. This is biblical passion. Feelings often come with zeal, but zeal might actually go against our feelings out of a deeper desire to know and love God. So it's not pure emotionalism, but secondly, it's not effortless. He says back in Romans 12:11, don't be slothful in zeal, or literally you could translate this, don't drag your feet in zeal. In other words, zeal, we may not experience zeal and passion and fervor 100% of the time. Some people I think are kind of like that, but not every person is going to experience that 100% of the time. But don't quench the Spirit. Don't be slothful. Work toward this. In other words, zeal is not just something that we can, sometimes I think the idea of authenticity gets in the way of zeal. We think that in order to really feel passionate and zealous, that I just need to feel it without putting in any effort or work. But nothing in life is really that way. Often zeal is on the other side of our devotion and commitment to something. And so while highs and lows are normal, we should never normalize this spiritual apathy, but foster, work toward a fervent desire to be something like this. This is what we desire. Not this flickering candle about to go out, but this blazing fire. In fact, as I was grabbing the mic and everything from the back, it reminded me of going out to Eric and Kelsey's property probably 2 years ago, and we had this raging bonfire, probably the biggest bonfire I've ever seen in my life. And all of us have probably been to something like that, where it just lights up the night and you have to stand 20 plus feet back because the warmth is just radiating. This is the kind of reality. This is what's meant to be normal. This is what is meant to be experienced by a life fully devoted and zealous to the Lord. That's on tap for us. So my guess is that you want that this morning. So how do we do that? How do we keep the fire burning? Well, very quickly, I want to get to a story, but first I want to talk about two very, very brief things that I think can kind of be like false starter logs. Maybe I could put it that way. And the first of these is nostalgia. Sometimes we think that in order to be zealous for God, in order to keep the fire burning, what we need is nostalgia, to go back to camp, go back to that sacred ground, that campsite where everything, I just felt on fire for God, or to go back to singing the old songs, the hymns that maybe we haven't sung in a while, to go back to hearing an old style of preaching that maybe hasn't stirred us in a while, but we hear it again and it stirs that passion in us that we remember from former days. Or sometimes even going back, and I think sometimes people who desire to be rebaptized are kind of falling into this idea. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with considering that. It's kind of a separate issue. But I think that's a desire, thinking, in order for me to be on fire for God again, I got to go back and redo this thing. And so one is nostalgia, but the other, in contrast, is novelty. We think that the way to be passionate and on fire for God is through new knowledge. That when I get that new piece of insight, when I listen to the Bible Project and I just hear this amazing thing that I've never thought about before, then all of a sudden I'm on fire again. Or new songs. That'll do it for me. I hear a new song come out by Praise and Harmony or Maverick City Music, and I'm just like, wow, my heart's on fire again. Or new members. We get an influx of new members and we feel fired up on fire. But new experiences, going on a mission, all these things, all these novel experiences we think are the thing that we need to set our hearts on fire again. Now, those are very good things. I don't think there's anything wrong with nostalgia or novelty, but they're almost like leaves on the fire, right? They burn up quickly. They sustain us for a moment, but then we walk away from camp or we walk away from whatever experience it is, and it just feels like that fire begins to die out. And so we should pursue these things, but we should know that they won't really keep the fire burning. Instead, I think a far better way is found in 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19. This is one of my most favorite stories. And it comes in the moment of the prophet Elijah when he has had a great victory atop Mount Carmel. And the backstory is this, that as he meets in what we could maybe picture as like Nissan Stadium, with all the host of people gathered in this one vicinity to watch the showdown between the prophet of God and the prophets of Baal, it comes time for his sacrifice. And he prays. Elijah the prophet, he steps forward and he prays to God, and listen for his zeal in this. He says, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so the people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Do you hear the zeal in that? You hear his passion. He is zealously devoted to service in the Lord, and he wants every heart in Israel to be burning, to be ablaze with devotion to God. And so God answers. The fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice. And not only the sacrifice, but listen to this, the wood, the stones, the soil, and licked up the water in the trench. Can you imagine? I mean, imagine really a showdown like this in something like Nissan Stadium, where you have the prophets of greed or of sex or of power gathered together to show down against the prophets of God who represent Jesus Christ. And the response is something as miraculous and powerful as this. The whole altar just disintegrates before their eyes. An amazing victory won for Elijah, and more so, he thinks, for God. And at first it seems like Elijah's zeal not only won the day, but won the whole nation of Israel back to God, just like he had hoped. But eventually word gets back to Jezebel, and rather than repenting, she seeks revenge. She seeks Elijah's head. And so in verse 3 of chapter 19, it says Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life into the wilderness. So Elijah goes from literally this mountaintop moment, full of zeal, to this strange, dark wilderness. And my guess is that this is familiar to all of us. One moment we're on fire, but then something happens, the tables turn, there's a plot twist in our story, and we don't know what's going on, and we just feel like we're in the wilderness. And the spiritual apathy settles in, and we lose our zeal, we lose our fire for the Lord. And in this moment, Elijah says this: I have had enough. Ever been there? I've had enough, he says. Oh Lord, take away my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors. And he lay down under a bush and he fell asleep. I want to acknowledge that this morning there is a very likely chance that some people in this room, and perhaps some people even recently, have said these words, Lord, take away my life, and perhaps you've really meant it. And I just want to point out that, first of all, Elijah, though he's in this state of severe anxiety and depression, he evidently still recognizes that it is not his own right to take his life away. It's something that he surrenders to the Lord. And more than that, if that is your experience, Elijah's story is a story of hope for all who've been in that depth of despair. And I think we'll see that as the story continues on. But I think throughout America, throughout the West, many people believe that Christians are just always happy and joyful and smiling, like it's like Christmas year round for them or something like that. But I think for most people, to some degree, they reach this kind of breaking point. Maybe not to the severity of Elijah, but we all reach this breaking point where we feel like we don't have anything left. This is enough. Lord, I'm just tired of this. Take this all away. And notice in this breaking point, three brief things that it seems God does for him. Number one, he lays him to sleep. He allows him to rest. And then in his rest, it says that an angel comes and prepares a meal for him and wakes him up, and he receives food and drink, and he's restored. And then he sends him out on a journey to Mount Horeb. And I think all these three things are vital for zeal. Resting, eating, doing, working are all a part of keeping the fire burning that we'll come back to in a moment. But Elijah, it seems by God's prompting, he goes to
Mount Horeb, which is known as the mountain of God, which we'll get to in a moment. But it says in verse 9, strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights, very symbolic number, and he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into the cave and he spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he replied, "I have been very zealous. I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to take my life too." And so Elijah vents this experience to God. He laments what he's going through. And these words, I think, are so real and relatable to us. I have been very zealous. I have been. I used to be. I was fired up, but Lord, now that zeal is gone. So verse 11, the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." I think there's something very unique about this mountain that God has led him to. It's called here Mount Horeb, but it's actually the same mountain as Mount Sinai. And this is the place where God appeared to Israel in a fire and wind and earthquake, and where he especially appeared to Moses when he proclaimed his covenant name to him, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. So do you see what God has done? He's brought Elijah back to the place of his covenant presence. And as Elijah stands there in the very same spot that Moses stood all those years before, something remarkable happens. There's a wind that comes and it rips the rocks off the mountain. There's an earthquake that shakes the whole place. And there's this fire that is raging. But God is not found in any of these: the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Finally, though, in verse 12 it says, "After the fire came the sound of a gentle breeze." This breeze can be translated multiple ways, and it might be a callback to the story in early Genesis when God walked with Adam and Eve in the breeze of the day. It can also be translated the still small voice, which might be an echo to the voice that Moses heard when God proclaimed his name, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love. But whatever the case might be, it says that upon the sound of this gentle breeze or this whisper or this still small voice, verse 15, the Lord said to him, "Go, return your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Elisha the son of Shaphat you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal." And so Elijah, he goes out from this encounter with God with a restored mission and a renewed zeal, and his heart is on fire again. And in some sense, Elijah actually becomes like that fiery altar that was set ablaze atop Mount Carmel. With a renewed zeal, he becomes the altar. He becomes the living sacrifice that God inflames to accomplish his purpose. And you remember how Elijah's stories end? How his story ends? Elijah is taken up in this fiery chariot, still on fire for the Lord. And so we return to our question, what does all this mean for us? How do we keep the fire burning? Well, I think we could summarize it in this way. The key to passion is the pursuit of God. The key to passion is the pursuit of God. That's the story of Elijah here. He is distraught. He's broken down in the wilderness. He's in despair. There is an apathy that has settled in. He has had enough. He's ready for it just to all in. But then it's as if he runs to the presence of God. For 40 days and 40 nights, he journeys to this sacred place to encounter God atop this mountain. Zeal comes by encountering God. And so when your fire is burning low, pursue God, run to him. And while that, I think, can be found anywhere, I think there is something vitally important about having that sacred place that we go to. For me, that has literally been a mountain. And incidentally, I just was curious and looked this up. It is almost equidistant, the same distance that Elijah traveled from the desert to get to Mount Horeb. But there's a place that I go, and I'm not going to tell you because it's my mountain, but find your own. But it's the place that I go to have my zeal, to have my purpose restored, to encounter God in a way, because I know in some real sense, though I didn't have some like tingling feeling or like indigestion, I knew in that moment that the Lord was present and that he was with me. And so from time to time, I go back to that place. Do you have a place like that? And for me, when I cannot go to that mountain, I think in my mind, the song that has meant so much to me for 15 plus years now, oh Lord, I need a mountain to climb on. And it's a way of reminding myself that I can be with the Lord, I can pursue his presence, I can experience him and be renewed by his zeal. That if he really is the light of the world, then the key to staying on fire is by staying close to the flame, by drawing near to him. Do you have a place like that? Whatever the case, find the thing that propels you into his presence, because the key to passion is the pursuit of God. But here's what I think is really amazing. The pursuit of God is not just our pursuit of him, but his pursuit of us. It's his pursuit of us. Thousands of years later, God would come not in wind, in earthquake and fire, or even in that still small voice, but in Jesus, the still small voice became a person. The Word, as John says, took on flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus came as that ultimate servant of the Lord. In Isaiah 59 and verse 17, listen to this. It says that he wrapped himself, the servant of the Lord wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. And then in John 2 and verse 17, it says this of Jesus. It says, zeal for your house consumes me. Jesus wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak, and in that zeal ultimately consumed him in his death on the cross. His zeal for God and his zeal for us, his pursuit of us, led to his laying down of his life on the cross. We have a God who doesn't just leave it up to us to climb up the mountain, but we have a God who has descended from that mountain to come down and dwell with us, to pursue us. And I think that's the deeper reality of the key to passion is the pursuit of God. It's knowing that God pursues me. That's how our hearts are set ablaze. And I love the way it's put in Titus 2 and verse 11. It says, for the grace of God appeared, bringing salvation for all people, to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. The zeal of Jesus now empowers and inflames us. And so this simple promise in Isaiah 42 and verse 3, the servant of the Lord, it's said of him, a smoldering flame he will not quench. If you feel like your passion is burning low, if you feel like the fire is burning out, if you feel like you're just that smoldering wick, the servant of the Lord promises he'll not quench that fire, but revive it again. And so 3 things as we close about how we engage in that in our everyday lives. To keep the fire burning, number 1, eat, sleep, and be merry. This is what happens in the story of Elijah. Very simple, very practical, but this is exactly what God does for him. And it's what really Israel was supposed to do every single week. Once a week, every 7th day, they were supposed to experience God's delight and grace through the Sabbath. A day of rest and eating and merriness with people that they know and love and care about. And they celebrate God's common grace together. And so to keep the fire burning, we, I think, first of all, just need to slow down. Maybe 2025 needs to be a year of slowing, not a year of doing, but a year of undoing, where we rest and delight in the presence of God, keeping the Sabbath in some way or another, and letting God renew our zeal through his common grace of food and sleep and fellowship, experiencing him through these delights. But the second thing is to abide in the sacred place. Elijah went to that sacred place atop Mount Horeb. And I think, as I mentioned a moment ago, we need some retreat to that sacred place. We need to find what that is for us. But the emphasis in that story is still on that still small voice. And I think what is being communicated there is that the sacred presence of God is not limited to the spectacular. God's not always going to show up in fire, wind, or earthquake in some demonstrable way that is just apparent and awesome with wonder. God, he shows up in the simple, in the mundane, in that light-footed companionship as he walks with us in the cool of the day. The still small voice. It reminds me of John 4 when Jesus says to the woman at the well that a day's coming when neither on this mountain or in Jerusalem will you worship, but one day true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. In other words, one day, as in the day that Jesus died for our sins and rose again from the dead, that presence of God was universalized in a way previously unknown. And it doesn't matter what mountain you're on or what place you might be in, the presence of God is accessible and near to us. And so what does that look like in our lives? Well, back in Deuteronomy 6, we looked at this a moment ago. But when it says this Shema, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, right after it, it says this, these words about loving God with our whole heart shall be in your heart. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you rise up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. In other words, center your entire world around knowing and experiencing and devoting your life to the love of God. Listening for that still small voice in every sacred space. This is how we abide. And then finally, to keep the fire burning, go in the Spirit of Christ. After this encounter that Elijah had on Mount Horeb, he's given this mission. to go and anoint the new king of Assyria, to anoint Elisha to take up the mantle of prophecy in Israel. And in other words, what I think this is getting at is that part of his renewed passion is a restored purpose. A restored purpose. And I think this is so important. Zeal is not meant to be just this inner experience, but it's meant to empower us to fulfill God's purpose, to create a people who are zealous for every good work. But zeal burns out when we don't use it. Zeal burns out when we don't, spiritual apathy settles in when we don't use the zeal that God has given us. And so if you feel low on zeal, then go and serve. Go and participate in the mission of God, and it'll reorient you in a powerful way. And so, to keep the fire burning as we make it through winter, eat, sleep, be merry, abide in the sacred place, and go in the Spirit of Christ. That just as Elijah ascended in that fiery chariot, but his spirit was given in a double portion to Elisha, who came after him, in very much the same way, Jesus has ascended into glory. But he has sent us his Spirit to continue his prophetic mission in the world. And so let's go in the power and Spirit of Christ. And let's keep the fire burning. Normally, we've been closing with a prayer, and I want to do that this morning, but I want to do that by reading what I think really summarizes everything that we've talked about so well. And it's the words of David found in Psalm 63. And I'm going to read it, and we'll close our eyes, or however you prefer to pray. But I want you to imagine this as not David's prayer, but as your prayer. And maybe even as you walk away from this fellowship this morning, you make this your prayer throughout the week, and you pray it time and time again until you feel like you actually start to mean these words. And that's what I'm trying to do. But I'll begin by inviting God to hear our prayer and then read the words of Psalm 63. Let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, you are our light. You are a consuming fire, and we want, O Lord, to be set ablaze. Help us to trust in the words of your servant that a flickering flame you won't extinguish, but that you'll revive our hearts and our love and devotion to you time and time again. And help us, Lord, to mean the words of the psalmist in Psalm 63. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there's no water. I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, in that sacred place, beholding your power and your glory. And because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I'll bless you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I'll sing for joy. My soul clings to you, and your right hand upholds me. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. If you desire to experience the zeal of the Lord this morning, and you recognize that he has pursued you and now you want to pursue him in baptism, we would love to help you with that this morning. Or if you need our prayers to have your zeal restored, there's few things more powerful than the laying on of hands in prayer to revive our hearts again. If we can help you in any way, come forward now as together we stand and as we sing.